If you were told that you were going to be given half an hour's interview with God and you had the privilege of asking one question, I wonder what you would ask. You might be given some preparation too, because when you think, what is your ultimate question, you'll probably do many things before you arrive at it. And I know many people would discover that they had no question to ask. The situation would be altogether too overwhelming. But many people to whom I've put this problem say that the question that they would ask is, who am I? And that is something we know very little about, because whatever it is that we call I is too close for inspection. It's like trying to bite your own teeth or to touch the tip of your finger with the tip of the same finger. And although other people can tell you who you are and do, they only see you from the outside, as you see them from the outside. And you don't see from the inside. And so the nature of what it is that we call I is extremely puzzling, because there is some confusion as to how much of us is I. We talk in ordinary ways about my body, my feet, and when we go to the dentist to have our teeth fixed, we regard him rather as a mechanic. Like you take your car to the garage, so you take your body to the surgeon or the dentist or whatever it is to be fixed, have the parts changed or something of that kind. And they're really getting to work on that now. And so the question is, when somebody has a heart transplant, that sounds very radical, because we say, in my heart of hearts. But nowadays, most of us seem to feel that whatever it is that I is located in the head. Somewhere behind the eyes and between the ears is the center, and the rest of us is an appendage, a vehicle, which carries the self around. Now, popular speech also reflects the sensation that I am very different from what we call the other. Other people, other things, anything that we can become aware of is sort of other. There is an opposition, apparently, between the knower and the known. And so we talk about facing reality. We talk about coming into this world as if somehow we didn't belong. And it has become common sense for most people living in the 20th century today to adopt the 19th century philosophy of science, which interprets the physical universe outside human bodies as being a mechanical contraption, which is essentially stupid, unfeeling, automatic, composed of mainly geological elements, rocks, gases, and so forth. And therefore we feel rather alone and left out of this thing. Instead of being at the center of the universe, we are on the outer limits of a minor galaxy, revolving around an unimportant star on a small, minute ball of rock. And therefore, that astronomical way of looking at things is simply overwhelming. It makes us feel not only of no importance, but also very much left out. And as a result, that is the common sense of most people living today. We did, of course, have a religious view of our nature, that we were the children of a loving God who is in charge of this whole operation. But very few people actually believe that anymore. A great many people think they ought to believe in it and would like to believe in it, but they don't. Most ministers that I know don't believe it, but they feel guilty about this because they feel they ought to. But it became implausible. There never was a serious argument against it. It simply became unthinkable in comparison with the dimensions of the universe as we now see it. So having lost a way of looking at the world, an image of the world which gave us some sense of meaning, we now have an image of the world which gives us none at all. And so we feel rather inclined to put up a fight against the whole show. Freud spoke of the basic psychic energy as libido, which means blind lust. People like Ernst Haeckel spoke of the universe as being a manifestation of blind energy. think of that put-down word, blind. And therefore we also speak of unconscious mental mechanisms. And the very word unconscious, as being the deeper aspect of our psyche, is a negative word and a put-down word. So as to say, what you are functioning as a rational ego with values and with a capacity to love is simply the epiphenomenon of a purely mechanical process. Too bad. What we think of as I is much more a symbol than it is a reality. The living organism, the whole mind-body, is much more than anything we mean by I. I largely stands for your personality, your role in life. And the very word person, as you probably know, comes from the Latin persona, a word originally used for the mask worn by actors in Greco-Roman drama. That through which sound comes, because the mask had a megaphonic mouth to carry the voice in open-air theaters. So when you speak of being a real person, it really means being a genuine fake, because the personality is only the front. What is behind it? Well, of course, the organism is behind it, the whole organism. And we must be very careful not to confuse the organism with various symbols that we have for it, because those symbols can be extremely misleading. If we say the organism is the body, what we usually mean by the body is an impoverished meaning. When we speak of my body, that is to say my vehicle, my physical automobile, that is an unenriched meaning of the word body. Because what you really are as a body, as a living organism, is not some sort of separate existence coated by a skin which divides you from the rest of the world. Shakespeare has King John saying to Hubert, "Within this wall of flesh there is a soul, counts thee her creditor." Within this wall of flesh, the skin considered as a barrier, when actually, from a biological point of view, the human skin and all skins are osmotic membranes. You know, when you get something by osmosis, by sort of soaking it in. So in the same way, one's skin is a spongy construction, full of holes, full of communicators, nerve ends. And your skin is simply a vibrating membrane through which the so-called external world flows into you and through you. So that you yourself actually are not so much an entity that moves around in an environment. You are much more like a whirlpool in a stream, and as you know, the whirlpool is constant only in its doing, that is to say, in its whirling. And you could recognize individual whirligigs in a stream. But the water is flowing through them all the time. They are never the same for a second. And so it is also with us. Or imagine it in another way. Supposing you have a rope, and 1 foot of the rope is made of hemp. 1 foot of it is made of cotton. 1 foot of it is made of silk. 1 foot of it is made of nylon, and so on. Now tie a simple knot in the rope. Now move the knot along the rope. And 1 minute it will be hemp, the next cotton, next silk, next nylon, and so on. Same knot. It will be recognizable as a continuing knot, as that knot, the knot in that rope. But the constitution of it will change as it moves. And so our constitution is changing constantly. Imagine, for example, a university. The student body, undergraduate, changes every 4 years. The faculty changes every so often. The buildings keep changing more and more. What constitutes the University of California? It certainly isn't the faculty, it isn't the students, it isn't the governors, it isn't the administration, it isn't the buildings. What is it? Why, a doing, a behavior, a universitying process of study and experiment and so on. So it is exactly the same with you. You flow. You are a process. But how do we draw the line about this process and its relationship to all other processes? We find that a very difficult thing to do the more you think about it. If you really felt with your whole organism, instead of just with that part of it called conscious attention, you would become aware of this flowing fact. And you would get a very strange feeling, which at first might frighten you. It is possible, of course, to have this feeling. And the feeling is like this. You would not be quite sure how to interpret it. You might feel that you yourself were doing everything else that's happening. That would be one way of feeling it. The other way of feeling it would be that you are doing nothing at all, but that everything else is doing you. And you would feel completely passive, like a puppet on the end of strings. Although, on the other hand, if you got the feeling that you're doing it all, you would feel like God Almighty. It is very easy for our consciousness to slip into this state of sensation. It can happen spontaneously, like measles. It can happen by training, as when someone practices yoga. It can happen chemically, as when certain drugs are taken. And one has to be very careful about this feeling because it's enormously easy to misinterpret it. Either as being omnipotent, being God in the personal, literal sense, or as being helpless and merely driven. Now, what should be understood is that both these ways of feeling are right, only they must both be taken together. To be simultaneously omnipotent and helpless. These are two poles, opposite poles of one and the same state. Because the message that is coming through, and that we find difficulty in understanding because it's contrary to our common sense, contrary to our whole history and conditioning, the message that's coming through is you as a living organism and all that is going on in your environment constitute a single process. What in physics we would call a unified field. A single process, like a pattern, but you know, any pattern has all sorts of subsidiary wiggles in it. Like the organism itself is a unified pattern, but it's full of wiggles. All sorts of tubes and organs and bones and nerves and so on. Working in this way. You know the body doesn't have a boss. We could pitch a big argument. Who is really the top dog in your body? Your stomach or your brain? I can argue for both ways. Well, let's first argue for the stomach. The stomach is fundamental. That's what eats, and eating is the fundamental thing of being alive. By putting food into the stomach, it digests it, and from there it goes out and energizes everything else. Obviously, the stomach is the most important. The hands, the mouth, the feet, all exist to serve the stomach. And naturally, as a final achievement of the stomach, is the brain, evolving later in the evolutionary process as a gadget up there to scavenge around and find stuff for the stomach to eat. That's the function of the brain. But now let's take the argument to the side of the brain. The brain says, oh, no, come now. Just because I arrived late doesn't mean that I'm unimportant. I was being gotten ready for. Because I am the thing that was the flower at the top of this thing. And this tube with stomachs in it and things below was preparing for me, and the stomach is my servant. It is doing all the dirty work, getting energy to put currents through my wonderful circuits, so that by the creation of all the goods of the mind, of the arts and sciences and religion and philosophy and so on, I shall be the true head of man. Well, both arguments are right, because you have a relationship between stomach and brain, which is a sort of polarity. The one exists for the other. It's like when you prop up two sticks against each other, they will stand up so long as they lean on each other. Take one away and the other collapses. So chop off the head and the stomach is finished. Take out the stomach and the head is finished. So this is the way all organic life proceeds. It's different with mechanical life, because the mechanism must invariably have a boss, the man who puts the machine together, the person who constructs the computer, who designs it, who asks it questions, who programs it. He is the boss. But organisms don't have bosses. They are essentially, I would say, democratic arrangements, where somehow, in a marvelous way, an enormous company of cells are working together. But that isn't the way. The body wasn't sort of one day a lot of cells all crept together and said we're a body. That does sometimes happen in the biological domain. But much rather this, when you watch the gestation of a mammal, you see first of all a very simple little organism which swells. And as it swells, it becomes more and more complicated from within. No parts are added. Nothing is screwed on. There's no welding done or anything like that. It bulges. And of course, it does absorb material, but it transforms it. But all of it works together at once, like the legs of a centipede. Like you work all together at once. For you see, when we come down to it, you think you decide things, but you don't know how you do it. How do you open and close your hand? You can decide, I will now open my hand and do it, but you don't know how it's done. And yet, in a sense, you do know how it's done, because I say, I know how to open my hand, but you don't know in words. You can't explain it. Still less can you explain how you see. Still less can you explain how you are conscious. How are you an ego? Well, you don't know. Because the springs of being conscious, of being an ego, are outside the surveillance of consciousness. They are somehow underneath. And that lets the cat out of the bag at once, because you see that what is I is something very, very much deeper than the superficial consciousness. And what you call I in the sense of the voluntary willing center, ego, has very little to do with it. You are just a watchman on top of the mast, or a radar on a ship that is scanning the environment by conscious attention, looking out for trouble, or looking for food. The real you is much too complicated to think about. Supposing when you woke up in the morning, you had to switch yourself on. That is to say, you had to, by an act of conscious attention, to go through your brain and turn on all the synapses necessary for wakeful life. It'd take you hours. Supposing you really had to be conscious of all the details involved in walking, or in breathing, or in circulation of the blood, you'd never get around to it. So you see, when we inspect the physical world with conscious attention, the first thing that strikes us is that the physical world is extraordinarily complicated. How can it possibly be organized? But actually, the physical world is not complicated at all. What is complicated is the task of trying to describe it in words, or of trying to figure it out in numbers. Because that is analogous to the task of, say, removing the water from the Pacific Ocean into the Atlantic with a beer mug. We can only take one mug at a time. And so we say in popular speech, you can only think of one thing at a time. That's not exactly true. But what it reveals is that thinking, that conscious thought, is a kind of calculus in which we understand things bit by bit. And it leads us into the superstition that things really are bits. Now, when you eat chicken, of course, you have to bite it, and you take it in bits. And to make it easier to bite, you order from the grocer a cut-up fryer. But you don't get cut-up fryers out of eggs. Because you see, although we can speak of a chicken, an egg, or a body, it is not actually a bit. It hasn't been bitten off, except for purposes of thinking.